The English setter is known worldwide as a symbol of grace and refined beauty, but genetic data reveals an ancestry that was never about aesthetics. It was about something much colder, more calculated, and hidden for centuries. Today, we decode the DNA to uncover the breed's true, forgotten origin. At first, it was not even called an English setter. It was known as the setting spaniel, a name that captures the oldest clue in its story. When the dog located birds, it would crouch quietly instead of breaking forward, allowing hunters to cast nets over the game. That single action explains why the breed mattered so much in an era before modern firearms changed the rules of the hunt. The dog was not admired because it looked refined. It was valued because it could disappear into the grass, freeze itself into silence, and turn a patch of land into a controlled advantage. This simplicity is deceptive. A closer look reveals a startling complexity. A dog that appears so graceful today was once judged by a hidden skill that depended on timing, restraint, and almost uncanny cooperation with human handlers. In the fields of medieval England, the English setter was already carrying a tension that still defines it. Beauty on the outside, function at the center. And that tension is exactly where the story starts to deepen. What makes the breed's early history so compelling is that it never belonged to ornament alone. The old setting spaniel was not wandering through the past as a show dog in waiting. It was a working partner, shaped by necessity, pressure, and the practical demands of bird hunting. That means every later description of the English setter as graceful, noble, or refined rests on something older and harsher. The elegance came later. The instinct came first. And yet even this is only the visible layer. Because once a breed begins as a specialized tool, the next question is never just how it looked. It is how many hands shaped it, how many lines were crossed, and how much of the original dog survived inside the final form. The English setter's earliest record seems straightforward, almost reassuring. But that reassurance is deceptive. The next part of the story opens onto a more complicated ancestry, one that modern DNA would later make impossible to ignore. In the 16th century, Dr. Johannes Caius saw something in the setter that most later portraits would try to soften. He did not describe a polished companion first. He described a dog that lowered itself quietly when it found birds, holding still so hunters could cast their nets over the prey. That image matters because it changes the entire mood of the lineage. The refined silhouette people admire today begins in a posture of restraint, almost secrecy. Before there was a familiar name, there was a method. That old account, preserved in the history shared by the American Kennel Club, points to an earlier label as well, setting spaniel. Even the name feels functional, practical, exact. It suggests a dog built to signal by body language rather than noise, to disappear into the rhythm of grass and wind until the moment mattered. Nothing about that description is ornamental. Everything about it is tactical. And once that detail is in view, a more unsettling question appears. If the English setter began as a silent working pattern rather than a fixed visual type, then what else about its identity was still unsettled? How much of the modern dog was already present there, and how much would only emerge after generations of selection, crossing, and correction? The answer does not arrive cleanly, because the historical record itself keeps shifting. One layer says tradition, another says utility, a third, still hidden, will belong to genetics. That is where the tension deepens. The early setter looks stable only from far away. Up close, it is a record of adaptation, not purity. The crouch, the patience, the coordination with hunters using nets over birds, all of it suggests a dog whose value came from behavior before appearance. Yet the modern English setter is remembered for grace, for feathered elegance, for the soft authority of movement. Somewhere between those two versions lies the real beginning of the breed's complexity. So the comfortable story starts to lose its footing. If a 16th century observer could already see a specialized pattern of work in the setter, then the breed's later identity cannot be explained by beauty alone. It had to be built, revised, and reinforced. The question is no longer whether the English setter was useful. It clearly was. The deeper question is what kind of ancestry produced a dog so precise in function, and why that ancestry has remained more layered than the public image suggests. That is the trail worth following now. Because once the old name, the crouching behavior, and the net hunt are placed side by side, the breed stops looking like a simple sporting icon and starts looking like evidence. and evidence never stays still for long. Then the trail changes shape. The moment the English setter enters the 19th century, the breed stops being only a memory of old working dogs and becomes something far more deliberate. According to the American Kennel Club, Edward Laverack began a selective breeding program that would help define the modern English setter, starting from two names that matter more than they sound at first: Ponto and Old Moll. Those dogs were not just entries in a pedigree. They became the anchor points for a line that would be repeated, protected, and refined until it carried a recognizable stamp across generations. This challenges the idea that the breed simply drifted into its present form. Laverack was an architect of the breed, not a gardener. He chose traits, narrowed variation, and held on to combinations that suited his idea of the ideal setter. In that sense, the English setter became less like a natural endpoint and more like a carefully edited manuscript, with each generation revised to preserve stamina, balance, and the elegant outline people now recognize at a glance. But this is where the tension deepens. When a line is fixed so intentionally, what gets strengthened can also hide what came before. The breed starts to look cleaner, more coherent, easier to describe. Yet behind that polished surface is a chain of decisions, not a single origin. Ponto and Old Moll are not just romantic names from an old kennel record. They mark the point where ancestry began to be filtered through human preference with unusual force. And that raises a harder question. If the modern English setter was shaped by such a focused program, then how much of its identity reflects ancient sporting function, and how much reflects the 19th century's desire to stabilize a type? The answer is no longer sitting in the old field alone. It is sitting in a breeding yard, in selection choices, in the quiet repetition of pairings that slowly turned possibility into lineage. That is why the breed's modern form cannot be treated as the same thing as its origin. It is a conclusion, not a beginning. The grace, the feathering, the controlled movement, those are the visible results of a much narrower path than the one that came before. And once Laverack enters the picture, the English setter becomes more than a sporting companion with a long memory. It becomes proof that refinement can be as revealing as ancestry, because every deliberate choice leaves a trace. Even now, that trace is doing its work. The more carefully the line is defined, the more the older mixture beneath it tries to surface. So the next question is not whether the modern English setter was shaped by human hands. It clearly was. The real question is what those hands selected away, and what hidden inheritance still survives under the polished outline. Keep that in mind, because the answer becomes sharper when the next layer opens. The moment the English setter stepped into a ring in 1859, something changed that no field could reverse. In Newcastle upon Tyne, England, the first show dedicated specifically to English setters, turned a working dog into a public object of judgment. From that point, the breed was no longer only carried in memory by hunters and breeders. It was being measured, compared, and fixed before an audience. The posture, the coat, the outline of the head, the sweep of the feathering, all of it began to matter in a new way. And once a dog enters that kind of gaze, history stops being only practical. It becomes visible. That visibility did not arrive all at once. It hardened slowly, page by page, until Edward Laverack gave the breed a kind of literary anchor with The Setter in 1872. The book was more than a personal defense of a favored line. It became the defining text around which the English setter's public identity could gather. Laverack had already spent years shaping dogs toward a particular ideal, but in print, he did something even more permanent. He translated preference into authority. A dog once judged by field performance now had a written image, and written images have a way of outlasting the people who made them. This is where the breed's apparent simplicity begins to break apart again. The English setter did not become stable because its past was simple. It became stable because selective breeding, exhibition, and description began to reinforce one another until the outline looked natural. Yet natural to whom? To the handler watching movement in grass? To the judge under gaslight? To the reader turning pages in 1872 and believing the type had finally been named correctly? Each answer points to a different version of the same dog. That is the unsettling part. Standardization can feel like discovery even when it is really construction. By 1878, the American Kennel Club had recognized the English setter officially as one of its 9 foundation breeds, and that recognition carried the type across the Atlantic as an established identity, not a loose experiment. Once an institution names a breed, it gives the breed borders. It decides what counts as an English setter and what falls outside the frame. From that point forward, the dog could be loved for its elegance, praised for its field sense, and admired for its balance, but it was also being preserved inside a rule-book of appearance and function. The old mixture did not vanish. It simply had to survive underneath a more polished definition. And that is the part worth holding on to. The public standard did not erase the deeper ancestry already traced beneath the breed. It covered it, disciplined it, and gave it a face the world could agree on. But the agreement was never the same thing as the origin. It was a decision made later, after the dogs had already carried a much older inheritance through generations of work. So the question shifts again. If the English setter was officially framed by shows, books and registries, what exactly was being preserved? The dog as it had been, or the dog as people wanted it to remain? Keep that tension in view, because the next layer is where the polished reputation begins to show its seams. In 2008, the story stopped being a matter of taste and became a matter of sequence. Researchers compared 5 pointing breeds, including the English setter, and they did it with 3 different windows into inheritance: mitochondrial DNA, autosomal DNA, and the Y chromosome. As established in the 2008 study by Animal Genetics, the English setter shows high genetic diversity, pointing to a legacy far older than the modern show ring. That mattered, because each layer carries a different kind of memory. One traces maternal lines, another spreads across the whole genome, and the third follows paternal descent. Together, they made the breed harder to romanticize and harder to dismiss. What the study found was not a single clean origin, but a crowded genetic landscape. Across the breeds, the team identified 236 autosomal microsatellite alleles, 4 Y chromosome haplotypes, and 18 mitochondrial haplotypes. Those numbers sound clinical until you understand what they imply. They point to separation, sorting, and long accumulation of breeding choices. The English setter was not standing alone in some untouched ancestral corridor. It was part of a field of related dogs whose histories had already diverged in measurable ways. The researchers also reported mean FST values of 11.2 for autosomal markers, 14.4 for Y chromosome markers, and 13.1 for mtDNA sequence data. In plain terms, these breeds were artificially separated and refined with surgical precision. Science was not just confirming that the breed was distinct, it was showing how much work had gone into making that distinction real. And yet the most unsettling part is what the method reveals by implication. If mitochondrial, autosomal, and Y-linked evidence all pull on the same question at once, then ancestry cannot be reduced to a single line or a tidy founding pair. The dog's history is distributed across inherited signals that do not always tell the same story in the same way. One line can preserve a maternal thread that another line never sees. One marker can strengthen a boundary that another marker softens. That is why this kind of comparison changed the conversation. It gave the English setter a biological profile that tradition alone could not supply. Animal Genetics, the journal that published the 2008 study, offered something more valuable than a headline. It offered a framework for looking at the breed without first deciding what the answer should be. Once you see the English setter through microsatellites, haplotypes, and differentiation values, the polished image starts to behave differently. The dog is still elegant, still unmistakable, still the same field companion people have admired for generations. But now the elegance has evidence behind it, and the evidence points to a past that was assembled, not inherited as a simple legend. That is where the tension deepens. The numbers do not erase the breed's identity. They sharpen it. They suggest that what looks unified today was once reached through many genetic decisions, some visible, some hidden, some carried quietly through maternal lines, and others fixed through male descent. The English setter, in other words, is not less extraordinary because the science is complicated. It is more extraordinary because the science shows how many layers had to align before the dog could look this effortless. If the record was this mixed in 2008, then the next question is not whether the breed has a history. It is how far that history reaches beneath the polished face everyone thought they knew. By the time the 2008 study reached the maternal lines, the English setter had already stopped behaving like a simple British story. One result, quiet at first glance, changed the direction of the whole inquiry. The breed appeared to share a common maternal origin with the English pointer and the German short-haired pointer. According to Animal Genetics at https onlinelibrary.wiley.com, DOI 10-1111 J1365 2052 2007 01658 X. That connection may point back to female dogs brought into the British Isles in the 14th and 16th centuries. Not one clean island lineage then, but a thread that crossed borders long before the modern dog show ever tried to name the pattern. That matters because maternal inheritance preserves a kind of memory that kennel portraits cannot easily erase. The coat may frame the English setter as unmistakably its own, yet the hidden root behind that coat suggests shared foundations with other pointing breeds. The family resemblance is not an accident of style. It is evidence of older movement, of animals carried, traded, bred, and rebred, until the distinctions people later prized began to harden. What looked like a closed national identity starts to feel more like a meeting place, and the study did not stop there. It also reported genetic diversity values in pointing breeds ranging from 61.7 to 68.2, a spread that implies contributions from genetically distinct individuals, even while those individuals still came from common ancestors. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes the texture of the whole breed history. Diversity here is not noise. It is a record of choices, crossings, and recoveries that worked over generations. The English setter was shaped by selection, yes, but also by repetition, displacement, and the return of traits through lines no one could fully see at the time. So the question is no longer whether the breed was mixed. The real question is how early that mixing began, and how many of the qualities now treated as fixed were already circulating centuries before the English setter acquired its modern name. If female ancestors reached the British Isles in the 14th and 16th centuries, then the roots of the story sink far deeper than the neat tradition of a distinctly English bird dog. Even the word setter begins to sound less like a label of origin and more like the last step in a much older transformation. That is the unsettling part. The breed's elegance does not sit above its ancestry. It is built out of ancestry, layer by layer, until the final form looks inevitable. But inevitability is a story people tell after the fact. The evidence points to something messier, more mobile, and more human. In the next layer, that hidden inheritance becomes harder to ignore because the record does not just show connection. It suggests design. Someone, somewhere, kept choosing certain dogs over others, and the consequences of those choices still move through the English setter today. By 2008, the story had become harder to keep in a straight line. In animal genetics, the comparison of pointing breeds showed a striking range of genetic diversity, 61.7 to 68.2, and that number changes everything. It does not point to a tidy family tree with one clean root. It suggests that different dogs, chosen over time for work, carried distinct genetic contributions while still coming from shared ancestors. The English setter does not stand outside that pattern. It belongs to it. That matters because purity, in the way people often imagine it, is a comforting word. It sounds complete, closed, certain. But the data pulls in another direction. When scientists measured the breed group, they were not looking at an untouched relic. They were reading the marks left by selection, by repeated decisions, by dogs kept for one trait and rejected for another. The result was not a fragile exception. It was a living population shaped by practical choice. The English setter, with its feathered coat and controlled movement, was never preserved in a glass case. It was built in motion. And once you accept that, the next question is no longer whether the breed was mixed. It is why that mixture produced such a consistent type. How can a line carry so much internal variety and still present the same elegant outline in the field? The answer begins to appear in the way breeders worked, not by freezing life, but by narrowing it. They kept returning to certain bodies, certain noses, certain temperaments, until the visible form seemed stable even as the hidden inheritance remained broad. The appearance of uniformity was an achievement. It was not proof of genetic simplicity. This is where the English setter becomes more revealing than the legend around it. A dog bred for birds had to hold tension inside itself, alert yet controlled, fast yet patient, stylish yet useful. That balance did not come from one perfect ancestor. It came from a long process of curation, in which many similar dogs were favored because they could do the same job. The shared ancestry mattered, but so did the differences between the individuals selected from it. That is why the breed can look so refined and still contain a deeper historical crowd beneath the surface. Seen that way, the word pure starts to collapse under its own weight, not because the breed lacks identity, but because its identity was formed through repeated filtering, not isolation. The English setter is not less English for that. It is more honest. Its heritage says that refinement in the sporting world was never a matter of sealing off the past. It was a matter of choosing, generation after generation, which fragments of the past would remain visible. And that leaves one final tension hanging in the air. If the breed's present form was assembled from individuals whose genes still point back to common origins, then the real story is not about contamination. It is about continuity shaped into function. The English setter does not expose a failure of breeding. It exposes how breeding actually works, not as a line guarded against change, but as a pattern made stable by selecting from change. Look closely enough, and the supposed purity disappears. What remains is something more intricate, more human, and far more durable. At the end of this trail, the English setter stops looking like a sealed portrait and starts looking like a working record, edited by generations of choice. The clean outline, the white and liver or white and orange coat, the easy reach in the field. Those are the visible marks. But the deeper story is written in the comparisons that geneticists made in 2008, when they placed pointing breeds side by side and found that not every hunting dog followed the same ancestral logic. One of the clearest contrasts in that study came from the Épagneul Breton. It appeared genetically isolated, holding itself apart from the broader exchange seen in other pointing breeds. Then there was the Deutsch Drahthaar, whose profile pointed to a different history again, a deliberate cross with the German short-haired pointer and additional breeds. In that light, the English setter sits in a more complicated middle ground. Not isolated, not a simple offshoot, but part of a larger family of bird dogs whose differences were sharpened by selection, while older connections still remained visible beneath the surface. That is why the numbers matter. The study reported high genetic diversity in pointing breeds, with values ranging from 61.7 to 68.2. On paper, that can sound like a statistic. In practice, it means the breed pool was not assembled from clones of one perfect ancestor. It carried contributions from different individuals, yet those individuals were not strangers in a total sense. They traced back to shared forebears, older working populations, and a hunting culture that kept recombining useful traits instead of freezing them in place. So the English setter's refinement begins to mean something else. The long, balanced body and the feathered coat no longer read as decoration first. They read as the visible outcome of a system that preserved scenting ability, patience, and field cooperation, while allowing style to become part of the final image. The breed looks graceful because grace was selected. It looks unified because selection made unity. But unity is not the same as isolation, and this is where the old myth finally gives way. What science reveals is not a loss of identity, but a clearer identity. The English setter belongs to a lineage shaped by repeated sorting, by breeders choosing which dogs could hunt, which dogs could endure, which dogs could move with a handler and still hold focus on game. That process did not erase history. It organized history into function. And once that is understood, the breed becomes more interesting, not less. Because the real surprise is not that the English setter has depth. The surprise is that its depth was hiding in plain sight, in every patient pause, every low glide across the grass, every trait that looks effortless only because centuries of selection made it so. The 2008 animal genetics comparison makes that visible. Pointing breeds can be distinct, highly differentiated, and still carry the memory of common ancestry. The English setter is one of the clearest examples of that truth. If you want to see the breed honestly, you have to let go of the idea that a refined surface must come from a single clean origin. The setter's history proves that excellence is built from curated mixture, not static purity, an inheritance shaped by human intent, and that is the final shift. The English setter is not a mystery because it lacks a story. It is a mystery because its story is larger than the legend people chose to tell about it. If you've enjoyed uncovering the real history behind the English setter's elegance, hit the subscribe button. We're pulling the curtain back on the true genetic origins of other iconic breeds in our next deep dive.